How do you do, neighbor? It's Berean Spirits time once again. The boys have gathered around, and they're ready for you. So join in, make comments, and study with the guys as they try to study as the Bereans did in Acts chapter 17. And now, here's the guys.
Welcome back to another episode of Berean Spirits. My name is Chris Peltz. I'm the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ here in Springfield, Missouri. We've got Richard Dodson with the Kearney Church of Christ up in Kearney, Missouri. Richard, how you doing, man?
Well, you can't see it, but I'm wearing a special shirt today.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Even in the summertime, the Chiefs are great. So I'm bragging about our Super Bowls. You know, So I'm getting ready for another exciting Super Bowl season coming up since we dominate the NFL now.
Right.
Yeah.
I see where your focus is.
Yeah.
You know, we're trying to do a religious program here.
Well, like you guys, I'll be ready when the bell rings, huh? You know,
the bell rang already.
Nobody knows this, but like 30 seconds from going on air, these guys are like, "What are we doing the show on today?" So that's the way it rocks around here. Not with me. That's the way it rocks with them.
Yeah. But that's all right. That's all right. We get her done.
Yeah.
We got Josh Thornhill with the Brookmead Church of Christ over in Johnson City, Tennessee. Brother, how you doing?
Good.
I'm doing good. I'm good.
Yeah.
Nice weather. Good time around here.
Yeah. Awesome.
Now, who are you looking at? You turned and looked at somebody.
Hey, we've got a live studio audience today.
That's right.
Of one. Oh man, no, it's great. Yep. So Kinsey is there with Josh. That's awesome. And
Josh got a girlfriend.
Yeah.
And I think that's news, man.
Don't embarrass him. He does that enough on his own.
Well, he ought to be proud. I mean, finally, I was talking to a preacher. This is a true story. I was talking to a preacher last week, and he was like, "That Josh guy, did he ever find a girl?" You got one? Hey.
Yeah.
You be proud, man. Thank God. You got a blessing.
I want somebody to type in and tell us how red he is. That's what I want to know. But
we love Josh.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. He is the one that provides us with all the great anecdotes and applications on this program. And so it would be difficult to do it without him. That's for sure.
It wouldn't be as interesting. That's for sure.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right, Josh, have we said enough? That's all we get for what you paid.
I reckon.
Okay.
Paid.
Oh man. Well, real quick before we get into our topic today, I do want to say something on another subject altogether. Maybe we can talk about this down the road. I'm not sure, but there's been some recent developments about some of this, the transgender ideology that has come out and the pressure that has been put on not only corporations, but colleges and different things. And two things I want to say about it. First of all, congratulations to the state of Missouri. Woohoo! Yeah.
Woo.
Right. They just signed into law that biological men cannot compete in biological women's sports.
That's got to be a law.
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
But you know what? It does have to be a law right now.
I know, but I'm like, I'm 60 years old. This was not the world that I grew up in.
No, it's not. Things have changed.
A lot.
Yeah.
A lot. We knew when I was young, we knew if we were a boy and we knew if we were a girl. I mean, that was just.
Oh, they know
it.
This isn't about whether they know or not. This is another thing. But let me say this though. Growing up, and Richard, you probably have experienced this a lot more than maybe Josh. I don't know. Josh can speak for himself here, but especially when I was growing up, people who were religious, right? People would tell you, listen, you believe what you want to believe, but don't, what would they say?
Judge.
No, well, yeah, they'd say the judge thing too, but don't push it on me,
Mm-hmm.
right? Don't force all that on me. Okay. Well, that's exactly what they're doing today. In fact, there's new, things that have come out where, especially the Leah Thomas guy that was on the girls swim team, the university got all the girl swimmers together without the man Leah Thomas and said, listen, this is what it's going to be, and made them not only uncomfortable but feel as though they were threatened, they were in the wrong, that I mean, just really, forced this upon them, to where girls who were very vocal against it all of a sudden, were scared to speak out, right? And so here those in the religious world are still, in this realm where people is like, listen, believe what you want to believe to a point, right? But just don't force it on me, or don't push that stuff on me. And yet here they are pushing that, and no one is speaking up. No one is saying, don't push that on us. Leave that, you want to do that on your own. You'll answer to God, but don't push that on us. And yet they're forcing it upon us. And those who speak out are the ones who are being called the bad guy. And so they are calling evil good and good evil, just as was prophesied. And so I just wanted to point that out because I think it's something we need to watch out for. We need to still stand up for the truth.
Well, yeah.
Amen.
So,
But don't expect evil people not to be hypocrites.
oh yeah, well, I mean that's what evil is all about, is hypocrisy to begin with. So absolutely. All right. Well, that kind of goes along with a reputation, what you have a reputation for, which is what we're going to be talking about, is having a reputation, and the benefits and the sense, what's the word? I'm at a loss now. But how, oh man.
Influence?
Well, yeah, the influence, but just how not sensitive, but fragile a reputation can be, because it is one of those things that, even as the proverb writer points out, it is a important and something that takes years to build up and means so much, but yet in a moment it can be totally destroyed, and so it is something that you have to constantly guard and maintain. And I want to give an illustration of a reputation that a man had, and then I'll pass it on over to you guys. But there was a gentleman, a faithful member of a local church, that was a widower, and he had a reputation, a good reputation in his neighborhood, and for those around him, those that knew him. And one Sunday morning, his car remained in the driveway, and his neighbor, who gets up in the morning, who drinks a cup of coffee, was used to seeing that man and getting his car and leave for church every Sunday. And he thought, that's strange. His car is still there. And he, maybe he's running late. After a little while, his car was still there. And he thought, he must be sick. Out here in a little bit, I'm going to go and I'm going to check on him. All because of the reputation that this man had. And so he goes over and he finds the man laying in the floor in his house, and had to call an ambulance, and saved his life. All because of the reputation this man had for every Sunday morning getting up and going and worshiping with the saints. And when that didn't happen, a neighbor who was not a Christian, who this man talked to and had influence with, recognized that this isn't normal. This isn't right. This man's reputation would say something is wrong if he isn't getting out on Sunday morning and going to church. And that's what we're talking about here in one sense, is that reputation we build through our conduct, through our actions, through our speech, through everything that we do, because it is the entirety of ourselves, our lives, that make up our reputation. So, Richard?
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking, about how our reputation, a good reputation, can open doors in serving God and make us a more valuable servant for Him. And I think Jesus addressed that in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has, and this is verse 13, if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. And so, we can see then that based on that, we need to be thinking about our reputation because of the influence, the good that can come about in serving God. Now, sometimes we can have a bad influence uh, through no fault of our own. That happens. People can spread and slander and spread lies, things of that nature, and that's not our fault. And of course, we got the Lord to help us with that. But from our standpoint, we need to think about how important it is our reputation in serving others, and that's that. The scriptures are filled with this. Um, the Apostle Paul, for instance, in Ephesians 1:15, he says to the Ephesians, "I've heard of your faith in the Lord Jesus." And he goes on to say, "I do not cease to give thanks for you, remembering you in my prayers." I mean, he heard of what they were doing. He said the same thing to in Colossians to the Colossi brethren. He goes, "We heard of your faith and of the love you have for all the saints." So, a reputation can influence others for good. A reputation will help us in serving God and opening doors, and we need to be careful about that. A good name, as the scripture says, takes a long. As you brought up, Chris, um, a good name is hard to build. And Proverbs 22:1, Ecclesiastes 7:1, it talks about them being chosen rather than great riches and a precious ointment. So, I mean, all these things, a good name that the scriptures talk about, and we need to make sure we try to preserve that the best we can. There was a preacher, and I'll turn it over to Josh with this, but there was a preacher when I was a young man. I went and heard a gospel meeting, and he was talking about when he was a young man, and him and his brothers would go out on a Friday or Saturday night, and the last thing that his father told them was remember your name. And that's something that I told my son because I never forgot it. Me and my son, we talked about our name and how important it is to preserve it. And so whenever I knew he was going out in a situation that might, he might be tempted to compromise, I'd always say, remember your name. And so that's I think some good advice that I got when I was a young man at a gospel meeting, and that's something that we need to remember.
Yeah.
Now, that's something I remember growing up. My mom, when we would go on a trip, like particularly a band trip, one that my parents weren't going on, mom would always tell us, remember who you are. And that's always a good reminder. But when I think about this, I think both of y'all are right in the sense that reputations are hard to build. It takes a lot of time and consistency to be able to build a good reputation. But it can be undone just like that. It's so simple to shatter it, and that's how fragile it can be. I heard about I don't know if it was a preacher or if it was just a man who went to this barber shop and he wanted to invite some of the folks to worship. And one of the guys in the barber shop said, "I'm never going to step foot in that building." And he was kind of taken aback by that and says, "Well, why?" And one of the elders there was one who frequented that barber shop, and they said that he had the foulest mouth of anybody in town. And so what kind of reputation does he have? He's caused so much damage to the cause of Christ because of his poor reputation.
Yeah.
I know of a preacher who got arrested for sexually assaulting children, and people on Facebook talking about the fact that he is comment section. You see that them talking about him a preacher and all sorts of stuff doing damage to the cause of Christ. I heard about a preacher who went to work with a congregation, and he's looking to buy a house there, and the real estate agent is saying, "Are you sure you want to preach at this church? You know they've had fist fights in that church, haven't you?" And so just so easy to damage reputations. One simple mistake can cause a great deal of harm to our reputation, and even worse, the cause of Christ. I think about 1 Peter 2 and verse 12, where Peter says to keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. I think what he's saying there is they may try and slander you, but there's nothing that they have to slander you with. Or if they do slander you, people are going to know, no, that's not him. He wouldn't do that. He's not that kind of person. And and you see that with Daniel in Daniel chapter 6, where Daniel was promoted to a very high place within the kingdom, and his contemporaries wanted to find something against him, and they looked and looked and looked and looked and couldn't find anything to accuse him of. And so they finally said, well, we're going to have to trap him in relation to his God. And so they set up that trap, and we know the rest of the story. But that illustrates the kind of reputation that we ought to have, the kind of person that we ought to be, that people are going to have to look hard and long and hard to be able to find something to say against us. And we all know people like that, where good people that you just have nothing but good things to say about them. And so I think the kind of reputations that we need to work on developing, and that's only going to serve us well as we seek to advance the cause of Christ. We can't hear you, Chris.
No, I can't hear you at all, Chris.
All right, there we go. So one of the things that's important for us, I think, to understand is that people are seeking to destroy reputations oftentimes, because what is more interesting to hear, the bad or the good, right? It seems as though that's what people want. People want the juicy stuff, right? They want to hear about everything that's going wrong, everything that's bad. And that's where it's real easy, to get into that. And of course it gets in, you can get into gossip and things like that as well. But here's the problem. People don't want a mistake to define them, but that's often what happens. That's the frailty of the reputation, is one mistake can define you for the rest of your life if you're not careful. And sometimes even among family, right? I mean, I was raised, with, in family that wasn't religious, that didn't go to church, didn't, have any regard for, for Sundays as far as any religious activities or anything like that. And when I obeyed the gospel and I made changes in my life, and I started talking to them and trying to study with some of them, it was all about, well, you used to do this or you used to do that. It's like, but I've changed. I don't do those things anymore. I've made a change. But that's what they would do, try to use to, point out, as though that's who you still are. And that just goes to show you how the negative is generally what people remember more than anything else. And you look at the people of history, whether it is, the Lewis and Clark, whether it's George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, all of these people of our particular country and nation. And you look at some of the things that they did, and yet, right now, everyone is looking at the negative and trying to define everything they did with something negative and not remembering the good. And that just goes to show you why it is so important that we guard ourselves and our reputation. I mean, Richard and Josh both pointed out there are those who are going to speak evil, whether they have anything bad to say or not. They're going to say something. They're going to turn it around. Can you believe that they think or believe, that baptism is essential for salvation? Like, well, that's true, but they say it in such a way that it's terrible, it's bad, and that they're trying to push this on people and try to do it in such a way to prejudice people against us, to destroy our reputation, because they've got nothing truly evil or bad that we've done that they can point out and say this is who they really are, when it comes to being hypocritical or things of that nature. And so that's what people are trying to do. And I'm reminded of 1 Peter chapter 4, and because you went to chapter 2, right, Josh? 1 Peter 2.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but in chapter 4, right, they're wondering, why don't you run in the same flood of dissipation you used to run in with us? And then it goes on how they're going to try and speak evil. They're going to try and come up with things. But, again, you stick to the Lord, and, all that'll come out in the wash ultimately, even if it takes the day of judgment for it to do so. Don't give up and don't give heart. Continue to work on your reputation. That's what we have to do.
I was thinking right before you spoke, though, Chris, I was thinking about people in history, and I was thinking about presidents and some of their quotes that they give that they're remembered for. For instance, Abraham Lincoln, he is remembered for the Gettysburg Address 7 years ago. I mean, most times if you had to quote something from Abraham Lincoln, somebody would start off, that's probably all they remember, 7 years ago.
That's all you remember anyway.
Yeah. And then John F. Kennedy, another famous president. If you had to quote one of his famous speeches, it would be, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And then you get to Bill Clinton, who had, a horrible thing. And what is the one speech that everybody could quote from him? I did not have sex with that woman. That's his most famous line. That's what he's remembered for. And so that goes to what you were saying, Chris. I mean, if one mistake can tear up a lot of good that you might have done.
Yeah.
And that's what people are going to remember you for.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's what the Bible has been warning all along. This isn't something new. It's not something that our society, our culture has decided, this is what they're going to do. I mean, going back to the Proverbs, there's a reason why it's back there, right? Where Solomon is writing about these things, because that's, that's how long this has been going on. And even before that, right? I mean, there were people who had reputations, going back to Genesis chapter 4, right? After Cain had killed Abel, right? Cain's son, later in chapter 4 of Genesis, one of Cain's descendants, like, hey, wait a minute, he's got this reputation, for killing Abel. I'm going to go and slaughter all these people. They're going to really talk about me, right? Even then they recognized the power of a reputation.
There was a painter we hired at one time, do some painting for us. And he came in and I got to talking, and I can't work off a ladder anymore. I used to, but I can't anymore. And our ceilings are pretty high. So he was painting. And this, the thing I'm going to talk about is when Chris brought up, there's enough people out there that want to slander us anyway, without us giving them fuel for the fire. Mm-hmm. But so this man, he's talking about going to church and this. And I said, well, you sound like you're very religious. And he says, yeah, I go to church. And I'm like, well, where do you go to church? We had that little discussion. And he doesn't know anything about me. And He goes, let me tell you about the Church of Christ. And he comes over and he gets in my face and he's saying, those people are so judgmental. And I mean, he just tearing up the Church of Christ. And he said that they think that they're the only ones going to heaven. And I mean, after listening to him for about 15 minutes, just say a lot of untrue things about the Lord's church. That's when he said, where do you go to church? And I said, I'm a minister at the Church of Christ, which was really funny to see his face. But yeah, there's plenty of people out there that are looking to tear you down. So you don't need to help them by giving them something that's actually, that's going to happen. But, we need to make sure that we preserve the Lord's good name. We wear that name Christian. That's the Lord's name. And the Lord built that name. And, out of his good grace, he gave that to us. And we didn't deserve it. We didn't earn it. All we did was be baptized into Christ for the remission of sins. And because of his grace, he took us into his family and gave us that reputation, gave us that good name. And we are fortunate because that good name, as I pointed out in those two passages in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, you can't buy a good name, but the Lord earned it and he gave it to us. And so we need to do our best as good stewards to preserve that name. To keep adding to it. Now, we're not going to do it as well as he did. No doubt about that. But that needs to be our aim. That needs to be our goal. So that when people, when they hear of us, they may say, well, he's not perfect, but boy, he sure tries to be.
Yeah. I mean, that goes to, sometimes we have a similar name or maybe the same last name with no relation to someone or maybe distant relation. I can remember my son working for the county here several years ago and met an individual who asked him what his name was and asked him his last name. And he said Peltz. And immediately the man stopped and looked at him and asked, are you related to, and and it was a distant cousin who was he was a terror. He really was. And, and that he was known for that. And of course, my son didn't know who he was and asked me, and I knew who he was, but it's one of those things that, sometimes that reputation can be so powerful. It goes well beyond you, but also that it comes to descendants. You can build a reputation up yourself and have a great reputation. And, and I think Josh is a great example of this, right? People hear the name Thornhill, right? And as long as it isn't my daughter's saying it, Thornhill. So, then it's people recognize, like, I know that name, and it's nothing bad, right? I mean, it's all, they would know his grandfather, they know his dad, they even know him, personally, and it's like that, the Thornhills, right? That is a name, but yet sometimes people will have children, and their children will raise, will go off and do something, and all of a sudden that name that you've built up you kind of like riches, and just as the Ecclesiastes writer said, you accumulate all of these things and then you die and it's just squandered away by those who come after you. Sometimes the reputation works that way as well.
When I was leaving home to begin preaching, my mom told me that my granddad had spent a long time building a good name for himself and basically telling me don't do anything to ruin it.
You tried.
But as I've been able to visit multiple places and introduce myself, and people, recognize that name, and then they start speaking about how well they thought of my granddad, you see just how that very thing works. And I think that I've benefited from that, from people knowing who he was, and the fact that I've I'm connected to him. And that can work in obviously good and bad ways. So I'm beneficial for that. But the reality is kind of what Richard was talking about. God has entrusted his good name to us. And if we just kind of sit there and let that rest on us for a moment, God has entrusted his good name with us. And the question is, what are we doing? Genesis 1 tells us that we were made in the image of God. What that tells us is that we reflect, or we're intended to reflect, the image of God. We bear his image, and we're intended to reflect that in the life that we live. And the question is, how good of a job are we doing with that? How much like our Father are we looking? Romans 8 tells us we're to be conformed to the image of his Son. That's what God wants, is to conform us to the image of his Son, to make us just like Jesus. And like Richard said, we don't perfectly represent him. Obviously, we're fallible humans, but that's our end. That's our goal. What we're trying to do is to imitate Christ and to be like him, so that the world can see him through us.
That brings up a good point, because there's one of those comparison contrast between, and I agree with everything Josh just said. But there is an example of what he said that relates to something different in the Old Testament that I'd like to bring up, and that's in Nehemiah. They came back to build the wall, and they did. In Nehemiah 6:15, I want to read this. It says, the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul, if I'm saying that right, in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around, and they heard of it. So they're going off hearsay. All the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. All right, so that's how the enemies felt just from the wall, because they were able to recognize, that this had to be done with the help of God. Well, if we do like Josh said, and we start trying to build Christ in our lives so that they can see Christ in us, then people are going to see a change. And even if you were just a horrible person before, once you're converted, when they start seeing that change, they're going to start saying, this can't be accomplished on its own. This is a work of God. And that's one way you can silence your critics.
Rahab is a great example of that. When the spies came in, right? Remember, she was like, "Oh, yeah, we've heard about you guys and what you did to Egypt." And what was she? She was a harlot, and yet now, when you look in the lineage of Christ, she's in the lineage of Christ. Right? You talk about a change that was made, and from hearing about the reputation Israel had, that's a great example there.
Well, and then you look at the Apostle Paul, and the change. You talk about a difference.
Yeah.
That's not help. That's not going to happen without God. He went from Acts 7 to the first part of Acts 8. Stoning Stephen, and who was someone that devout Christians thought highly of, but he was there holding the coats of those who killed him. And he says this to the Galatians in 13 and 14. You have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. And so, we know that he had this reputation, even when he was being converted, when Jesus appeared to him in Acts 9, and he went into town, the Lord tried to send Ananias to him. The Lord said, go talk to him. And you would think, if the Lord says something, you just, it's kind of like Lord says jump, you say how high, that kind of thing. But the Ananias argued with him. He said, Lord, I've heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And it carried on even after he was converted. It said he attempted, in verse 26, when he come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they not believe that he was a disciple. So, and he called himself the chiefest of sinners. But yet, look what he became. And it wasn't him. It was this was a work of God. And it was taking somebody who was so far against God, even though he said he did it with a good conscience, he was still so far against God. And now he was with God. And it was, there's no way you could look at his life and say that this wasn't a work of God, because it was a work of God. And the same way that it is in our lives as well. And so if we really are mindful of our reputation, we're not going to interfere with God's work. And those who are outside of Christ may be drawn to Christ because they see that work of God, just like the enemies of Israel, saw the walls being built. Hey, I got a correction. Chris Kramer writes in, I said something earlier that was wrong, and he is right. I know this, but I'm old. So he said FDR said fear itself,
Amen.
quote, JFK, ha, 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 ha. Very funny. JFK said, that's not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Well, either one of those works. But yes, I appreciate that. And he also said this, Clinton did say one thing, right? Being president is like being the groundskeeper in a cemetery. There are a lot of people under you, but none of them are listening. So that's pretty good. That's
I like
pretty good.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Josh, go ahead.
I was just going to point out that it's kind of interesting. You mentioned Ananias being like, wait a minute, I know what this guy is like. But then when Paul goes back to Jerusalem, the brethren are still afraid of him. And then Barnabas has to come and vouch for him.
Uh-huh.
And he has to tell them, oh, it's okay. It's all right. He you can accept him. He'll be all right. It just shows how difficult it could be to overcome those bad reputations. Sometimes.
And in the midst of that, it shows you the power of Barnabas's reputation, not an apostle, but they listened to him.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And the Lord provided Barnabas to help Paul overcome that reputation. And that's a lesson for us today as well. No matter how bad your reputation is, if you go to the Lord, you'll have the help of the Lord in overcoming it. The Lord can put you on the right path to have a good reputation, but you got to include him, because this is not something that's going to be done by yourself.
Josh, you keep getting interrupted.
I did?
Yeah.
Did I interrupt? I'm sorry.
No, I did it first. I interrupted him, but then you jumped right in and just kept him silent. Of course, he's probably used to that this week anyway, but I digress. Go ahead, Josh.
Oh, I won't say that. I won't say that.
Well, I think what those show is that there is hope in overcoming a bad reputation, which is a blessing. And I think you see that in 1 Corinthians 6 with the Corinthians. The unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God, and such were some of you. But you were washed, but you were sanctified, but you were justified. And so they are changing their lives with the Lord's help, obviously, to be able to overcome their bad reputation, although probably from a societal standpoint, they weren't such a bad, they didn't have such a bad reputation there. But it is a blessing that our past doesn't have to define us, that we can become a new creature, that we can become different, and that we can change our past or change our life, and we don't have to be defined by who we used to be. We can be better, and we can be known by who we are now. And what a powerful story of hope that is to other people as well. I mean, you think about who Paul used to be and who he was now, and if God could forgive Paul of all that he did and use him so greatly in his kingdom, How much can God take me and use me in his kingdom? That is a story of hope, that we're not too far gone. If we're willing to surrender ourselves to the Lord and be used for his service, and we can still do a lot of good for his cause.
You know, one thing I want to say with all of this is, even with a good reputation, that's not what saves us, right? You look at Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. Everyone talks about, oh, he was a good man. He had a great reputation as a Gentile among the Jews. Not only that, when you look at what Luke is writing in the book of Acts chapter 10, he had a good reputation, was spoken well of, not just by the Jews, but this is the word of God. God was speaking well of Cornelius in his reputation, what he was known for, but yet, as Peter pointed out, and we learn throughout that story in Acts 11, verse 14, there was a message by which, he would be saved. He had to obey the gospel. He had to be baptized into Christ. That's what we read in that text. So his reputation did not save him, even though it was a good one. And so we still need Christ in all of that. I mean, Richard's been stressing, that, it can't be done without Christ. And that's where it comes together with salvation. Obviously, there is no salvation outside of Christ. And so all of that comes together, and Christ needs to be a part of it, no doubt about it. But there are those who look around and people speak highly of. They have great reputations, and they've done a lot of good, and they've benefited communities and industries, and yet we're not Christians. We're not saved. They and that's unfortunate, but nevertheless, we see reputation is important. It's fragile, but it is absolutely important for us to work on. Josh?
Amen.
I think you see in Matthew 5 with in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about the fact that we are both the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And that speaks to the influence that we are to have.
I love it when Josh goes to a point that Richard made as though Richard never made it. That's awesome, Josh. That's just, oh man, it makes my day. Go ahead.
But it points to the fact that, again, like when you connect that with John 3, Jesus says that those who are in the darkness hate the light because their deeds are exposed. And I think that speaks to, as we talked about earlier, why why people are not going to like us, even though, we're not doing anything wrong. But we have that responsibility
yeah.
To continue to shine the light and not hide it under a basket, but keep it brightly shining to those around us so that they can see Christ in us.
Any last thoughts though, Josh, as we wrap this up?
Oh, those are my last thoughts.
Okay. All right. Very good. Richard, last thoughts?
Well, Josh brought up Daniel before, and Daniel's actually a good one, because in Daniel 5, it talks about Daniel, when he first came to the king to be able to read the writing and its interpretation. The reason he came before the king is in Daniel 5:14. He says, I've heard of you, that the spirits of God's in you. And so that's an opportunity. And we know where that led to when we read the book of Daniel. He actually came before the king based on his reputation. And so the point I'm trying to make is doors can open when people hear about us. And so if you're out there doing the Lord's will, when someone's out there seeking, doors can open. They may come to you because of what they've heard of you. and that'll give you an opportunity to tell them the truth. And so don't ever forget that. That makes yourself meat for the master's use. Keep yourself a sharp tool in the Lord's tool cabinet so he can use you at his good pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other comments or anything that came in that you want to point out, Richard, before we get off?
No, nothing. There was nothing else to add to the discussion. No.
All right. Well, folks, we appreciate everybody who tunes in and listens, and those who comment. We appreciate that as well. Be sure and share out the program to everybody that you know, and let them know about us every Thursday morning at 10 o'clock Central Standard Time. And until next time, remember to search the scriptures with Berean spirits.
Well, folks, that's all for today. Don't worry. Lord willing, the guys will be back next week for another Bible study on Berean spirits. Until then, let the guys hear from you. Drop them some email at bereanspirits@gmail.com. They'd love to hear from you. Until next time, let's keep studying that Bible.